guys, welcome back to my channel. So today's video is my August wrap-up. Very excited for these books. I did not really vet these books before I read them, seeing which ones I was going to be reading together. So this month was kind of a heavier month in terms of the tone of a lot of these books. It was still a good reading month. They're all really great books, but I will say it was kind of a dark month. I feel like August being a summery month, and typically I'm a mood reader, so normally there would be some happier books in here, but anyway, for whatever reason, it was kind of it was a more intense reading month. So this is the stack. It is a very odd mix. We have some children's books because I'm reading my way through all of Joy Harjo's books so that I can do a whole video on her like I did for Chuck Palahniuk. So that was fun. That was keeping things a bit light. But yeah, some of these are quite intense. So I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, including the 3 children's books. So let's dive in. So since I'm going to be doing a whole video on Joy Harjo, I think I'm going to go ahead and get all of her books out of the way. The 3 children's books were The Good Luck Cat, For a Girl Becoming, and Remember. And I feel like you can kind of tell from the illustration style, it's oldest to newest. So this one came out in, I think, the year 2000. It's really cute. It's about a native girl who is just very much in love with her kitty cat. He accidentally escapes one day, he runs free, he leaves the house, and it definitely upsets her, and she's remembering all the times where he got himself into a bit of a jam, and it's sort of her missing him and worrying about him and thinking about his 9 lives. I guess I'll just spoil it for you, but in the end he does come back. So I thought that was very sweet. Next was a little bit more serious. This was For a Girl Becoming. The idea is that this one you would sort of give to a new mom, who's just had a baby girl, or a girl at her graduation or something like that. And it basically follows a young native girl through her childhood, through girlhood, up into womanhood, and kind of all the things that she's going to be faced with, but how you need to sort of stay true to yourself. I thought it was very sweet. It would definitely be one to read to your daughter or something as she was growing up. I know I've heard people passing around a book like this to the girl's family, or family friends or teachers, people in her life who've been there for her in her formative years, and then gifting it to her on graduation. I think that would be so cute. So who knows, maybe one day I will do that with this book if I have a little girl. So yeah, I thought it was really very sweet. And then the final children's book was Remember. This one just came out this year in 2023. I love this one. I think this one's my favorite because the art is so pretty. It's so gorgeous. This one was actually a poem that Joy Harjo already had written, and it basically is just the storybook companion, or sort of the illustrated adaptation of that poem, which I think really speaks to how universal and pure a lot of her work is, because it could easily be adapted into a children's book. But at the same time, if you're a parent and you're reading this book to your child, you're still gonna get something out of it as an adult. You might even probably get more out of it than an actual child would, because it's so reflective. It's all about remembering where we come from, and I thought this one was quite precious as well, and so stinking cute. And then the other Joy Harjo that I read was an actual normal book for adults, and it's The Spiral of Memory. This is actually interviews, so this is not a book of poetry like most of her work is. She was still kind of I don't want to say a fledgling poet. This came out in 96, but she's been writing pretty seriously since the 70s, I think. She has a lot to say about her work, and a lot of people very curious about her work and her inspiration and her experiences. And so a lot of these do repeat because a lot of the interviewers are asking sometimes the same questions. So it did feel a little bit repetitive at times, which I didn't mind, because I do think it's awesome getting an insight into her creative process and her experiences and why she writes about the things that she does. I would say if you are like me and you're really interested in kind of doing a deep dive into her work, because she is such a prolific Native American writer, this has probably been the most helpful book in terms of understanding where she's coming from and her background. And it's really the only book that I've read so far where she's kind of analyzing herself, analyzing her own poetry and her own style. Okay, and then the last thing from her that I actually forgot that I read, because it's not in like book form, I had to find a PDF of it. It's like the graduate college at the University of Iowa. I think maybe they had like an archive of it or something. If you just Google the title, which is What Moon Drove Me to This, you will find this PDF that you can download and print, like I did. This is her thesis, so this is really like the first thing that she wrote as like a professional poet. So before her books of poetry came out, I think some of these are from She Had Some Horses, which is one of her earliest works, so she was kind of already working towards that first book of poetry. It's so difficult to describe poetry. I don't even know how I'm gonna film that video without just giving you examples and just putting her poetry like up onto the screen for you guys to read. You guys can kind of get an idea of her style that way, because it is so difficult to describe. So I will put some poetry on the screen for you right now. So you're kind of getting an insight into baby Joy Harjo before she really fully developed into like the person that she is today. All right, now we're gonna get into some of the more intense books that I read. First up was The Journals of Captain John Smith. This was pretty high on my list of priorities of what I wanted to read because I recently rewatched The New World, which is a Terrence Malick film. It came out in 2005. It's gotta be, maybe not my absolute favorite movie of all time, but it's definitely way, way up there. It's top 3 for sure. And I just realized how little I know about John Smith and Pocahontas and, you know, other important figures of the time. And I kind of wanted to actually read the real story because we all know, like, this relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas. It's been basically completely fictionalized over the course of hundreds of years. So I wanted the real story. The foreword in this basically says, like, even though John Smith talks about a relationship, he does not go into any detail, and he's really relying on a lot of other people's writings at the time to kind of complete his journals. So this was interesting to read because it was not, it's not like the Disney story, it's not like a love story. It is very much documenting his time in Jamestown. Smith was a very interesting fellow. So he was 26 around the time that he sailed across the ocean. Where there's a will, there's a way kind of guy. Like that is very much kind of what he seems like. He was a bit mutinous at the beginning. I think he was actually sentenced to death at one point. He was definitely a man of many talents, and one of those was kind of being able to argue his way out of any situation, and that's why he wasn't actually put to death. So the main thing that I kind of wanted this book to answer was when Pocahontas supposedly threw herself on top of him when he was about to be killed by the Powhatan tribe, who she's the daughter of Chief Powhatan. What did that mean? Like, what did that symbolize? And historians definitely disagree on what exactly her actions may have meant. Obviously, there's no way we're gonna know for sure. But this was fascinating regardless of kind of not really getting questions answered in terms of what exactly their relationship entailed or what it meant. Because there's so much in here about different Native American rituals and ceremonies and just their culture. There's a lot in here about trade and the things that they would trade back and forth and the different tribes and different tribes who were warring at the time, and then how Smith and his crew were able to use that to their advantage. Now, if you ever went to a history class when you were in school, you know that the good times between the future colonizers and the natives did not last very long. You know, Smith and his crew got to the point where they were starving. They didn't know how to plant. They didn't know, they were in way over their heads. They had no idea how to take care of themselves, basically. So they would burn their canoes, and so they would burn one and kind of wait to see what they would do. And of course the natives would you know, gesture for them to stop, and then so he would use that as an opportunity to say, okay, so now you're going to trade us for this if you don't want us to burn this canoe. So while he was this very mythic figure in Native American history, he's still quite horrible. I'm glad that I now officially know, which I've known for a long time, like that's not the true story, but it is nice to read the actual journals. Can you stop shaking the camera, please? Thanks. I am glad that I officially know the story now, though, because we don't want to keep those Disney lies going. If anything, this has made me really curious about herself, like Pocahontas herself, and I actually want to read books about her now. I think maybe they're not going to be from her perspective, but they'll at least hopefully give me more insight into her life. So I have one on order. It is on the way. All right, guys, new location. So boyfriend came home yesterday from an errand, and we spontaneously decided to go for a swim, and then I did not film the rest of my video yesterday. So anyway, I have 4 more books to talk about. One of the books that I read for my Reading Around the World challenge, for Mexico, I read some Yuri Herrera. I have heard his name before back when I was in university. I know that his name came up and I must have read something by him. Maybe it was poetry. I wish I remember what I had read by him. But anyway, read Signs Preceding the End of the World. I did like this one. I think I only gave it like 3.5 stars. Not because it's not an incredible story and incredibly well written. I just felt like it was a little too short. It's more of like a novella length. I kind of wish there was more and the story was a little bit more fleshed out. So it was not like a 5-star for me, but I did really like it. I love the main character. I think McKenna is how you pronounce her name. She is this young woman who is basically going to find her brother. She's got to cross the US-Mexico border. She's kind of a spitfire. She can really hold her own. She can take care of herself, that is for sure. There are some moments where you're like, is this about to get dark? Definitely kind of a #strong female protagonist type situation with this book. I do feel like the language was a little bit metaphorical for me. I've said this in other videos, but I am such a literal brained person that sometimes when authors choose to write about things in a very metaphorical way, sometimes I feel like I'm missing something. Also, there's no dialogue quotes. Like the formatting for the dialogue was tricky for me because there's nothing separating the dialogue from the regular prose. And so there were times where I was having to go back and be like, oh, that was somebody talking. There's no dialogue quotes. So that was kind of tricky for me too. So it was more of like a formatting thing and a length thing than a writing thing. It felt more like a short story, and with a lot of short stories, you know, sometimes they begin and end very briefly and very abruptly, just because that's the nature of a short story. So that I kind of felt like I had to knock it for that, but still an incredible story. Then another one for my Reading Around the World challenge was The Blind Owl. This was for Iran, I believe. This is the 75th anniversary edition. I loved this book. I will say it is very, very dark. I liked this because there's a lot of like Carl Jung, shadow self kind of metaphors and imagery in this. It's very psychological. Again, it's very dark. It's very heavy. I definitely want to emphasize that if you think you're going to go into this and it's going to be like a pleasant read. Like it's a good book, but it's not like pleasant to read because of how heavy the content is. But the story is essentially him having these very traumatic, dark, psychological thoughts. It feels kind of dreamlike, a little bit hallucinatory. It feels a bit like deja vu. It's one of those books that's very kind of like reality skewed, which I love. I've read several books like that in the past over the last couple of months. So if you are sensitive to like sad books, I would say you're going to want to steer clear of this one. There are definitely some quotes in here that tend to romanticize suicide. In my journal, I wrote down some of those quotes. He says, and the narrator's unnamed, I believe, throughout the book, but he says, "For a long time, this feeling was born in me that I was decomposing alive. Not only my body, but also my soul. A strange, inharmonious mixture. What was frightening was that I felt I was neither completely alive nor completely dead. I was but a moving corpse that could neither join the world of the living nor partake in the oblivion and peace of death." So there's a lot of this kind of wishing he was dead. He's basically mourning this other character who I believe is only referenced to as the ethereal girl, who we assume was maybe like an ex-lover or something. And so he's sort of kind of wishing, almost like a Romeo and Juliet kind of, she's gone and so now I want to go with her type of situation. The author did commit suicide himself. And so I kind of feel like this was sort of a lead up to that maybe. So we can kind of assume this was something that was he was exploring in literature first before he ended up actually acting on that in real life. It is not a happy summary book. Like I said earlier, I did not vet these books before I read them, so there are some pretty dark things in these books that I read this month, but just beware before you go into it. It's an excellent read, it's just very dark. And then staying on that train of darkness was Magdalena by Wade Davis. This is for Colombia. This is basically the entire country's history. There is so much in this book. She is quite thick. Each chapter kind of feels like an article or an essay over a different aspect of Colombian history. Wade Davis is not from Colombia, but he basically traveled there in his teens and completely fell in love. He said it was sort of the only place that's ever really felt like home, and basically lived there ever since. He really writes about the country and the people and the culture with a lot of empathy and a lot of deep knowledge. The story focuses on the river Magdalena and how important it was all throughout history for travel and trade and living, and there's a lot in here about what's happened to it since and all of the pollution and everything. He talks a lot about the coca leaf and cocaine and the production of cocaine and how it just has completely ruined the country's reputation basically and has been the cause of the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. There's a whole chapter, more than just one chapter, a couple chapters on Pablo Escobar and his reign of terror and the many, many lives that he cost. There's even a section on how his former estate has been turned into a theme park, apparently, some sort of water park, which I thought was really weird. I will say if you have a queasy stomach, this book is probably not for you because Davis does not sugarcoat any of the violence. He goes into a lot of detail about the languages and the culture that's been lost since the arrival of Columbus. I do like that he kind of balances the really dark, heavy parts of Colombia's history with a lot about like the biodiversity. He says something like 10% of the Earth's biodiversity comes from Colombia itself. Like there's more bird species and plant species in Colombia than like any other country on the planet, which I didn't know. So he does pepper in a lot of his personal experiences in there to kind of make it a little bit more enjoyable at times, because there is so much in here that is very dark and very heavy, a lot of death, a lot of gore. There are some descriptions of like torture and that sort of thing, so it is a heavier book as well, but incredibly informative. So much in here that I know now about the history of Colombia. It definitely makes me want to travel there, even though the history is so dark. It's just so rich ecologically. So as dark as this was, it was a 5 stars from me just because it was so well researched. And very well written. And then finally we have The Tragedy of Man. This is a Hungarian play, so it was translated from Hungarian. Originally came out in like the 1860s, I believe. It's a 1-act play. There's about 15 scenes in it, and it is essentially Adam and Eve in paradise. And it actually starts a little bit before that. There's a scene in heaven where Lucifer is not yet a fallen angel, and then he tempts Adam and Eve in, like, I think scene 2 fairly early on. He basically wants to show them everything that they're missing. If they would just listen to Lucifer and do what he says, there's an incredible wealth of power that they're missing out on. And so he basically like kind of puts them to sleep. I think in scene 3 they have this incredible sort of hallucinatory ride through different parts in history, like different points in history. He makes Adam a pharaoh at one point in time. Eve is his wife. I want to say there's even a scene in outer space at one point. It's pretty crazy. It's a pretty crazy story. So it kind of reads a little bit like a Shakespeare play. It's not the most accessible read, but it was easy enough to understand. It kind of feels like a mix of Shakespeare and Goethe's Faust, if you've ever read any Faustian literature before, it's kind of like that as well. You've got, the main character who's tempted and sort of gives over part of his soul. I have such a respect for translators now that I never thought that I would have before. To be able to translate from not just from one language to another, like the words themselves, but to keep the rhyme scheme and the cultural nuances, and to be able to keep all of the like metaphors and everything in check is so incredible to me. Like, I don't understand how it's like even possible. It was quite incredible. This was subscriber recommended too. I will put whoever that was up on the screen. Thank you for recommending. I did really enjoy it. I would say even if you're not into like biblical stories, or you don't really even need a background knowledge of that, I think you could still really enjoy this. It's just kind of an interesting, it's almost like a thought experiment or something. It's almost like his version of Faust, basically. That's kind of what it felt like. So I did enjoy this one. I gave it, I think, 4.5 stars. And that is everything. If you guys made it this far, thank you for watching. Let me know what you read in August, and of course give me more international, like translated recommendations for my Reading Around the World challenge. You guys have been awesome with those recommendations so far, so let me know what you read. Maybe give me some happier, lighter books to read. If you have anything that's a little bit more upbeat, a little bit happier, definitely let me know and leave those recommendations in the comments, and I will see you guys next time.